Thank you. That was a really fascinating conversation about how the U.S. energy landscape is changing, the intersections with policy, and what that might mean for the rest of the world. We're going to, in addition to our keynote conversations today, have a few panels to go deeper into some of these issues, what the outlook is for U.S. Energy production, what is happening around the world in some different key regions, and what's happening in the U.S. affects that. And then we're also going to talk now about issues around climate change, around clean technology. We could have a whole day-long conference with the group of people that is up on stage right now. I'm going to let David Sandalow introduce them. David is known to all of you, I assume. He's the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He has held too many senior Senate-confirmed positions in the U.S. government to list, but most recently was the acting Undersecretary of Energy before joining the Center on Global Energy Policy, again as our first fellow. He joined just a few months, I think, after our inaugural event in this rotunda 5 years ago, and few people have been more central to the Center's growth and success than David has. So I want to thank him for his leadership and partnership and friendship and commitment to the Center's success, and please turn it over to you and the panel. Thank you.
Well, Jason, thank you so much, and congratulations on this 5-year anniversary. It's been wonderful working together, working with you, working with Dean Janow, and helping to build this tremendous platform. It's also just been a tremendous amount of fun. It's wonderful to see what this has become. And we just have a spectacular panel here, so let's jump into it. Let me introduce them, starting over at my far right, at your far left, we have Tom Werner, the CEO of Sunpower. Then right next to him, we have Dave Banks, who served as the Special Assistant for International Energy and Environmental Affairs on the National Security Council and the National Economic Council until a few months ago, and as of yesterday is now an Adjunct Research Associate here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. So welcome, Dave, to the Center.
It's great to be here.
Then we have Cameron Hepburn, University Professor of Environmental Economics at the Smith School and Fellow at New College at Oxford. Ruth DeFries, who is University Professor of Sustainable Development right here at Columbia, and then Jeannette Wing, Director of Data Science Institute and Professor of Computer Science here at Columbia. So lots to talk about. I'm going to start with you, Tom, because you made news yesterday. So Tom's company yesterday bought a company called SolarWorld USA. SolarWorld is a US manufacturer of solar panels. It was one of 2 companies that petitioned the Commerce Department for the imposition of tariffs. President Trump then imposed those tariffs, and now Tom's company, as of yesterday, has just announced that you're buying SolarWorld. So could you tell us, one, about your company and about this acquisition and what your plans are?
Yeah, so Sunpower was founded by a professor from Stanford University, and he had the idea of making a highly efficient solar cell, so turning photons into electrons more efficiently than it could be done at the time. That continues to be the case. That's what we excel at. We make our solar cell in the Philippines and Malaysia and have for 15 years. And by virtue of duties, that there was Solar 1 and Solar 2 duties, and then a 201 trade case that Sunpower opposed unsuccessfully, that the 2 petitioners on the other side of the trade case, one was called Suniva and one was called SolarWorld, successfully petitioned the ITC to impose tariffs on all foreign-made modules, which would include, or currently does include, Sunpower. There is an exclusion process that is underway where we petition to be excluded, and the comment period just ended, and we'll see how that goes. We think we fit the exclusion criteria exactly what they're looking for. We'll see. That's their call. We made a decision as an American company, by the way, publicly traded and over $2 billion in revenues. We made the decision to buy SolarWorld. And we made that decision because tariffs were imposed, and so we have to deal with that reality. And that reality suggests that we could make a decision to buy SolarWorld and make the economics work. By improving the technology that SolarWorld produces, I should say part of what they produce, and also it is clear, and David will probably speak to this, that this administration wants more American manufacturing. And so I've been quoted a lot in the press in the last 24 hours, it's better to swim with the current than against the current. And so we will be the domestic solar manufacturing industry. We will represent that. So that's why we did the acquisition, because we think we can make it work economically. That's our job. We're publicly traded, and because it made sense for America in the context that we operate in.
Tom, for your core business, as I understand it, and as you just mentioned, you're seeking an exemption or an exclusion from the tariffs. How will that decision impact your research and development?
Well, it's a super big deal. Just so you all have a picture of what we do. We make a solar cell that looks like this. The important thing here is there's no metal on the front of it. A conventional solar cell has metal on the front. Super hard to make this. Therefore, it costs more. And the tariffs are ad valorem tariffs. That means it's a percentage on the imported or declared customs value at import. So ironically, as an American company with over $1 billion of America labor spend over the last 5 years, we pay the highest tariffs. We pay $2 million a week starting soon. We don't have $2 million a week. So the impact on research and development is that you have to make trade-offs. All of our research and development's in America, and now once we close the deal, a meaningful part of our manufacturing is in America. So we will generate the $2 million a week by cutting costs. Now, alternatively, and this isn't a pitch to any policymakers, that's not how it works, there's an exclusion process, but alternatively, we could not spend the money on tariffs, and we could invest that in American research and development and in now American manufacturing. So there's pretty close to a one-for-one here, where we will reduce our R&D spend to pay the tariff, where we could not do that if we didn't have to pay the tariff. It is literally one-for-one. I'm sure some of you have looked, you can just go online now and look at our finances, and I think you'll find what I said to be credible.
So Dave, you are now a former government employee,
Yes.
which means you are free to speak your mind. Could you tell us, what are your thoughts on the solar tariffs, first of all? Good idea, bad idea. And then just to broaden the conversation, just any thoughts about the Trump administration's energy technology policy overall? What's the strategy, and how do you see that developing?
Well, they're related. So good question. And by the way, when I saw the news, I thought it was great that you guys made that investment. Look, I mean, the president is about manufacturing. You know, how do we resurrect parts of U.S. manufacturing? How do we protect it? And how do we enhance our manufacturing sector? The president sees manufacturing as a foundation of American power. And I think a lot of people they don't quite appreciate, where he's coming from. And that's a whole different conversation we can have at some other point. As far as, Tom and I talked a few times about this while I was in the administration. I think that for us, so just to give you a little bit of context, we really had two different process points here and processes, I suppose. One was on the 201 itself, and the other one was a process that I worked on with my colleague Mike Catanzaro, who had just announced that he was leaving, or that he's leaving. He does the domestic energy environment policy in the White House. But we were really looking at the issue just from a strategic perspective. So I think the big question that we had was, okay, so you got the 201, the president's going to want tariffs. That's the baseline assumption here, particularly with the ITC finding. And so we decided, well, what does it really mean, and how should we approach the 201 from, let's call it an industrial energy policy, and I think that for us and me in particular, I wanted to ask the question: is solar a strategic industry that the United States should invest in and protect and promote? And I think it was a pretty easy answer for us, and the answer, of course, was yes. Right, particularly given solar's growing role in the global energy market, et cetera, as a technology. No question, it's strategic. And so then the question for us was, well, again, how should this inform the 201 process? I think where we came out, and it was an evolving discussion, but where we came out was, well, this 201 piece is a really, really small slice. And it's really focused on technologies that, if they're not antiquated, they're going to quickly become antiquated, right? And the question for us is, are we going to be able to regain some kind of competitive advantage in this? And the answer, I think, was no, right? Really unlikely. And so therefore, we should focus on investing in advanced solar technologies and developing a competitive advantage there. And then, so regarding the 201 specifically, I think where we ended up was, let's don't do anything that would undermine that long-term strategic objective. Now, that was our input in the process. You can figure out exactly how much weight went into that, But look, again, it's an agenda that the administration cares about as far as technology, energy innovation, what it means to U.S. strategic interest. Secretary Perry's a huge proponent. The administration will continue to advance that, particularly looking at it through the lens of American competitiveness.
Well, great. I want to come back to policy in a few minutes, but turn to some technology questions in this space and ask Jeannette Wing, the head of our Data Sciences Institute here at Columbia, about energy technology. Now, there's a lot of attention these days on big data and the impacts of big data and what it can do to transform lots of industries. Could you share with us any thoughts about how big data will have an impact in the energy sector?
Well, let me speak first about big data, but then more broadly about machine learning and AI technology, which is very thirsty for big data. Specifically to energy, there are some, let me first actually talk about some of the advances in technology that are so exciting and making everyone stand up and think about how big data can help their sector. And probably the advance that has really made this splash on the New York Times and so on is this machine learning technique called deep learning. This is basically a layered network. You feed a lot of inputs at one end, you get some prediction at the other end, or a classification at the other end. So the canonical example is this deep, long layered network where you feed a lot of images in and out pops out, yes, this is a cat. Yes, this is a dog. It's an image classifier. This technique was also used in the Google DeepMind program that beat the human Go player. And that program, that sounds frivolous, but in fact, the techniques in that program, that deep learning, machine learning program, was also then used by Google to make their data centers run more efficiently. So that's the connection, a very point-to-point connection of how some of these machine learning and AI techniques can very directly be used in the energy sector. More generally, however, where I see the use of big data and all the machine learning and AI techniques that are hungry for big data is in all the processes that any sector would have in terms of production to distribution to monitoring and, in the end, predicting behavior of any process that you might be running in your sector. So where I see this is in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of even at the production end, but also at the distribution end, and storage, energy storage. So all the steps in whatever pipeline you care about can be revisited when you can have these deep learning, these machine learning models fed by big data. But there's another point I wanted to bring up because you mentioned manufacturing and the US. Another technology that everyone should be aware of that's kind of in our face already, again, fed by big data, fed by machine learning algorithms, is robotics. So when you see all the advances in self-driving cars, it is due to big data, big compute, and efficient algorithms. And self-driving cars are, after all, just a big kind of robot. So what we're going to see is, yes, maybe we will bring manufacturing back to the US, but a lot of those jobs will be automated. So this has policy implications, not just technical implications. And so I think the way to think about big data is that's the start of this pipeline of technology where the excitement right now is in the machine learning and the AI algorithms. So that's one way to think about it.
Well, thank you. Let me turn next to Ruth DeFries, university professor here, and I believe you won a MacArthur Genius Award for your work on satellites and GIS systems. And can you talk about how those can help inform our understanding of climate change and the energy sector?
Sure. Thanks, David. So we're going through a revolution now in sensors, the ability to see the land, sense the atmosphere, detect pollution. Sensors are becoming more and more inexpensive and publicly available, and it's in the last decade has changed dramatically in terms of what kinds of data for just observing our planet are available to everyone, to the public. So with that ability to observe comes the match, and that big data that's created comes the match with machine learning techniques, which lets us start to understand what we're seeing. And we're seeing a big enhancement of what we can understand at finer and finer spatial resolutions. So in terms of energy and climate mitigation, for example, you may have seen the announcement, it came in the New York Times, the Environmental Defense Fund, for the first time, a non-governmental organization has taken on itself to launch a satellite. And this is MethaneSat, which will be able to detect methane leaks from the oil and gas industry at very, very high precision. So what that enables is the ability to target our efforts, target our climate mitigation efforts to where it makes the most impact. And that is game-changing because we have limited resources for climate mitigation, and where would you devote those resources? Similarly, the ability to observe forests and forest clearing, which is a contributor to carbon emissions and our climate change problem. With the ability to see where those changes are occurring at higher and higher resolutions, we can make more sensible and targeted decisions about where to put our mitigation efforts.
Cameron Hepburn knows a lot about a lot of things, so I want to ask him first about technology and then get to some policy issues. You spent a lot of time in the energy sector. Are there any energy technologies that you're particularly excited about or think we should be paying attention to?
Loads, and I'll share some of them with you in a moment. Just reflecting on what some of the others have said here, though, first, if I may, I agree entirely with what David has just said about the strategic importance of the energy industry, particularly the clean energy industry, at this juncture over the next few decades. And for a country like America, I'm an Aussie and a Brit, and so I'm the foreigner here at the moment. But for a country like this one, your comparative advantage is in the high-tech space. It's in the smarts, it's in the R&D. So what we just heard, this is exactly where America should be playing. Now, we had an agreement in 2015 that the leading industrial countries would double their spend, public spend, on research and development. It's called mission innovation. And that strikes me as a very sensible thing to be doing for humanity at this particular juncture when we know the energy system is in transition. It's not about to happen, it's happening now, as the chief executive of Shell said recently. As I understand it, and maybe David or someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but the Americans have kind of pulled out of mission innovation or not implementing it. I'm not exactly sure what the status is there. I'd love to get an update, but that seems like a very strange move in a situation where, as you say, it's strategically important, and as you both demonstrated, there's a major interest in America in winning in the high-tech area of energy. So that's the first thing I wanted to say in reaction. David, you asked about technologies. I think as I say, the system is now in transition. It's because it's not just shale gas and fracking, but it's also, you know the story, solar coming down in cost dramatically, wind, batteries, etc. And we're at the point now in the UK, I don't know how many of you have ever been to the UK. I'm Australian, really. I love living in England, but it's not very sunny, not much of the time. And we're at a point now where solar is subsidy-free competitive in the UK. Right? Which is nuts, really, but that's how cheap it's getting. So this is significant. Actually, wind is subsidy-free. You've just seen auctions in the Netherlands, in Germany. This is happening across northwestern Europe. Subsidy-free, clean technologies competing on their own terms and winning in these auctions for procurement. And those technologies, that learning has been part R&D. It's been part deployment economies of scale. But what it's left us with is a sense, okay, we can kind of see the trajectory now of the future of the energy system. And remember, we've got to get to net zero emissions by around 2050, right? So if you're making long-lived capital investments now, it's almost 2020 to 2050, 30 years, last time I checked. If you're investing in capital that's going to be around for 40 years, it better be zero carbon at this point, or at least you better have a plan for making it zero carbon. So and what's happening with the energy system being in such flux, such transition, new business models, new companies emerging, making lots of money, is that the other sectors that are going to be affected by this rewiring of the global economy are starting to imagine what their sectors are going to have to look like. So to answer your question properly, David, if you take the steel industry as one example, it's often thought that this is going to be very difficult to decarbonize, relies on metallurgical coal. The Swedes, and we had the chief executive of Vattenfall at our equivalent to CERAWeek, I guess, the Aurora Spring Forum in Oxford just a few weeks ago. And they're investing now, they've passed pre-feasibility in a zero carbon steel technology. And their attitude is, well, we can't beat the Chinese on dirty steel, but nobody's nailed clean steel. And maybe if we nail it, we can have a continuing competitive advantage in clean steel. You could say the same thing about EVs. The Chinese see exactly the point you've made about the strategic importance of clean energy. And the other Western economies countries are thinking, well, where's our position? So the UK's government has just put almost $200 million equivalent into the vehicle supply chain for electric batteries because it sees the significance of that too. It's because the UK actually does manufacture quite a few cars. I could go on, but perhaps I'll stop there.
That's great, thank you. So let me turn to Dave first to follow up on Cameron's point. The pledge in Mission Innovation was to double clean energy research and development budgets within 5 years. As I understand it, the current administration is not committed to doing that in light of what you said, why? And then I read, Dave, that you've called the Paris Agreement a good Republican agreement. Is that an accurate quote, and could you elaborate on that? So first Mission Innovation and then the Paris Agreement.
So Mission Innovation, look, I think that there's a lot of desire on the part of the administration to work with it as much as possible. Going into, starting in February of last year, and this is kind of inside baseball, so I'm not sure, how much you want to get into this. But I think it's just worth noting that, when we started, we were essentially handed a budget from OMB, right? That slashed spending across the board. And it wasn't just from DOE, it was across all agencies except for the Department of Defense and maybe Veterans Affairs, perhaps. The president directed Director Mulvaney, hey, look, I want to increase spending here on defense, et cetera, but I don't want to add to the deficit. And so those were the instructions that OMB were following. Really tough job they've got over there. But we didn't really have a policy process that teased through, some of these budget issues related to energy innovation, et cetera. But again, I really want to stress how important the energy innovation agenda is, particularly to Secretary Perry. And look, again, the president wants the United States to be the most competitive economy and he recognizes that innovation technology is key to this, right? The president talks about energy dominance. What does it mean? It's not just about U.S. fossil fuels, but it's also about U.S. energy technologies and services, right? And capital equipment, et cetera. So it's kind of the full body of it all. So I guess what I would say is give it a little bit of time. You know, we had the omnibus. I think the omnibus ended in a really good place when it comes to sort of energy innovation in general. And I think over time, as the administration can work through the policy, right, and helping sort of correct what I would consider to be flaws in the 2018 budget, some of these things will be worked out. And I see energy innovation and the technology pieces being the foundation of a climate change policy, but I'm fairly certain that the administration will roll out at some point, right? People accept that. There's a consensus around it. It just hasn't been really publicly presented as such.
Any thoughts on the Paris Agreement?
On the Paris Agreement, look, some of my colleagues, their heads exploded when they read that headline in the New York Times. But look, it's just the truth. The Paris Agreement, if you look at the structure of the Paris Agreement, and my old boss Jim Compton's sitting there, it's basically everything that we wanted. I think we would have wanted more, right? But I think the Obama team probably negotiated or helped negotiate the best deal or the best framework it could get. I'm not talking about the pledge, right? The Obama pledge, U.S. pledge is something different. And I think I would put that aside and separate it from the actual agreement. In our opinion, the pledge is not a good Republican pledge, but the agreement is a good Republican agreement.
So we've gotten several questions from the crowd, including one on energy storage. It was directed to Jeannette, and then I want to turn to Tom on energy storage, because I'm sure you're thinking about this issue too. But there was interest. Could you elaborate on how data scientists can help us with energy storage?
Actually, I don't know what the intent behind the question is in terms of energy storage, but I am glad someone asked, because it gives me the opportunity to talk about what I anticipate another technology in terms of energy storage, and what I like to call macro meets micro. And so macro, we talk about power companies, utility companies, sort of the energy usage, sort of at the industry level. And the micro, I mean by our individual energy footprint. And it seems like a lot of technology, especially here at Columbia, is going to measure how much energy we actually use at work, at home, and that seems like at the micro level. So how do these two meet? One of the technologies that I anticipate are electrical vehicles, which are basically mobile batteries. And so imagine that we basically have this completely decentralized storage network of energy through these cars that are just these small little batteries, but if you add it all up, that's a lot of storage capacity. So that's one technology that's already here, and we're just going to see more of them. And then there's a question of how is the energy ecosystem going to benefit and exploit that kind of storage mechanism. For instance, individuals, we're going to go to the point where individuals are going to want to kind of give back some of the energy it has through solar panels and whatnot, been able to produce, because it can't use it might as well, get paid for contributing. So are the big utility companies ready to receive? And how are they going to distribute and store this? So I think these are very interesting technology and policy questions. I don't know if that was the intent behind that question on energy storage, but it got me the opportunity to talk about cars.
Tom, how is storage affecting the solar industry today, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, it's not clear that storage is affecting solar or vice versa, but it's definitely they're correlated. It's super interesting. First of all, the economics of storage are paralleling solar, say, 5 or 10 years later. So as the industry scales, cost comes down, and in solar, the figure of merit for every doubling of capacity, there was a 20% cost reduction. So we're seeing something similar in storage. And what that does is it obviously makes it more economic. So is storage economic? The answer is unequivocally no. But it is in some applications, and that's where policy comes in, and it's super interesting. There's a thing in the, for Sunpower, a year ago, 5% of the systems we sold to commercial customers had storage. Today, 30%, and that'll soon be 50%. So it is happening in months, not years, in the commercial sector. However, if you sort of said, forget policy, where would storage make the most sense? At large scale, commercial scale, or residential, it's not entirely clear that it might be at transmission and distribution in the utility scale. But policy is driving commercial first. And that's because there's things like demand charges, where you pay your energy charge is the highest 15 minutes. The rate of that sets a rate for all of your energy. So if you have storage, and you can eliminate that highest 15 minutes, you can lower your energy bill on all of your energy. Of course, that'll shift it to the next 15 minutes. That's happening prolifically, and I like to say capitalism works. I hope David likes that. I think he will. And so when you have that policy, it's proliferating. So Hawaii, New York, Massachusetts, next probably Illinois, where there's policies, and of course the utilities have their rate structures that will encourage that. And what's cool about the combination of storage and solar is software and perhaps machine learning and AI, because then of course you can't run and hide. Once you can store solar energy economically or other energy sources, you have the choice of when to use it, and you can arbitrage, and software allows you to do that flexibly as policy changes. So creating a massive, interesting opportunity, the combination of the two.
I want to jump to another topic that Ruth has thought a lot about, and that's agriculture and its impact on the global environment, and in particular, climate change. Could you just talk about the role of the agricultural sector on climate change, and are we doing enough to address that?
Yeah, well, first of all, agriculture is probably the most important thing we do as a species, because we all need to eat. But agriculture does contribute about 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere in many different forms. One form is through the clearing of land to make space for agriculture in the first place, which is a contributor to CO2 in the atmosphere. Another big contributor is methane through ruminant livestock, very big contributor. Fertilizer use, nitrous oxides. So there are all many different pathways through which agriculture contributes to climate. Agriculture is also one of the biggest sectors to have an impact of climate change in terms of changing weather patterns and droughts and floods and so on. Water availability for agriculture in many places around the world are starting to feel that in different ways. So agriculture is a big part of the story, and where there are opportunities to reduce emissions from agriculture, that is not the biggest elephant in the room. I'd say the biggest elephant is the energy sector, but reducing emissions from agriculture can certainly contribute to a solution, and one very obvious way is through reducing clearing of forests for expansion of agriculture, more efficient use of fertilizers, all of that contributes.
We've got a number of questions from the crowd. There's one on the use of rare earth metals and other rare materials in renewable energy. Cameron, I've seen you comment on this recently, so I thought I'd ask you about that. And let me frame it this way. Do you think that the availability of rare earth metals and lithium and cobalt and other types of minerals are going to be a constraint on the growth of renewable energy technologies in the years ahead?
Good question. I mean, I think the short answer is probably no, not a constraint. The thing that people are worried about is that in 2017, 58% of the cobalt came from the DRC. And so it's more a political issue, and you've seen kind of more than doubling of the prices of lithium and cobalt in the last few years. But I'm basically a fan of markets, and these are markets that work pretty well. When you have a price rise, you get a all sorts of responses. You get a supply response. You have the other countries that have got these minerals and metals digging more up. You've got a demand response. We're seeing batteries being developed that don't have lithium in them now, and other parts of the clean economy that have much lower levels of cobalt. So I think in general, we're going to have to, as I say, rewire the economy and rethink about all of our resources, includes land, and Ruth's point about reducing emissions is right. I mean, if you look at the Shell scenario, Sky, that was released by their chief executive a few weeks ago, they're using agriculture to suck, I think, around 6.5 or 5 to 10 gigatons a year of CO2. So it's a potential remover. So you've got to reimagine land, you've got to reimagine minerals, you've got to reimagine the processes behind shipping. We saw the IMO agreement in London last week to cut shipping emissions by 50%. That means in the 2030s, you've got to have container ships that are completely clean. And we don't have, I mean, there's some technologies that might be able to do that. I was looking at a pelletized hydrogen solution on Monday, actually, in a lab. But we don't exactly know how this is going to play out. So I think this moment is incredibly exciting because there's so many of these sectors that need to be completely reimagined.
Jeannette, can I just ask you on that front? There's so many people who are thinking about data sciences right now and wondering how their sector can kind of play in these new data sciences. Do you have any advice for people who are broadly thinking about that question? What steps should they take?
First of all, I like to talk about the data life cycle, where the start of the data life cycle is generating data. And every sector, every company in every sector is generating data, whether it's through sensors and devices, whether it's through people who use your services and products. You have the opportunity to collect that data. So that's the second part of the life cycle. You generate data, then you collect it, store it, manage it, and then analyze it. So the heart of data science is in the analysis, and the advances that we have made in computer science and data science are in those techniques. Fed by large amounts of data, you can build models that do prediction, that do classification, that do optimization. Those are the sorts of things that allow you to figure out how to make your processes more efficient, how to, where to put your resources, knowing based on predictions what's going to happen, and including in those data sources are things like climate data and natural environment data, not just people data and sensor data and so on. So you take weather information, you take the natural oceans, what's happening all around. I mean, as much information as you can get. And so people are talking about building very sophisticated, very fine-grained spatial temporal fine-grained models to do simulation and prediction using this big data. So whatever your sector is, you can, I mean, give me a sector and I can't think of any way you can't use data. Yesterday was just with the biomedical informatics department, and we were talking about all this data to enhance people's wellness and health. And you know, that even people information is part of energy usage and so on. So it's really it's as creative as you can be, but you have to, so here's my advice. My advice is that you make sure that your employees are trained in data science. And it's not that you have to become go through a program, but they should understand basic statistical and computational techniques that can analyze data, that can build these machine learned models so that you can use these models effectively, because your competitors will be doing this.
Okay, one quick follow-up. I don't think I've been in a technology discussion for the past year in which the word blockchain has not come up. So we've now made sure that it came up in this conversation. Just any quick thoughts about blockchain and its implications?
Yes, so I do have very strong opinions about this, because I'm glad you asked me about blockchain technology as opposed to cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin. There is something definitely novel and important about blockchain technology in terms of it providing a distributed ledger that's tamper-proof and auditable. Those properties for what that capability can do is pretty phenomenal. So now people can start talking about distributed contracts with so on and so forth. What is missing in this technology, before I get to that, however, I would like to warn all of you who are about to jump on the blockchain wagon that be a little suspicious of claims about the security guarantees of the implementations that these blockchain companies are purporting to have. Because first of all, be suspicious, period, if ever anyone says, I guarantee some security property holds. Because we know that the bad guys always can find vulnerabilities to those kinds of guarantees. But even if you were to assume all of that was fine and the blockchain implementations have these security guarantees, even if you assume that, then what's missing in the blockchain technology today is the ecosystem for governing blockchain technology. So for instance, suppose there's a conflict and you need to resolve this conflict, and you need to go to some third party to resolve this conflict. Well, now all of a sudden, you have broken this purely distributed nature of the technology. And that governing body does not exist today. So it's phenomenal technology, but what's missing is the whole infrastructure around it to really make it shine.
Tom, could you talk about technology innovation in your business, and are you using data sciences and blockchain? Or, I know you have some of the most efficient panels around, so how are you thinking about this issue?
Well, I like what David said about competing on both the past and being careful not to expend too much energy on the past and look to the future. And of course, at the core, our job is to make a higher efficiency, lower cost solar cell. So we're obviously doing that. And that is about tracking the movement of an electron and increasing the likelihood that electron is used productively. And that's very sophisticated stuff. But beyond that, there's applications of blockchain in the supply chain today that, was pointed out, either you do it or your competition will do it first to make your supply chain less expensive. So there's innovation in the supply chain. And then the incorporation of storage and actually being a good citizen of the grid requires a lot more control over how you use the energy and predictive analytics of what's the optimum use of the energy. And so being able to offer your customer inexpensive solar energy that will optimize the value of it is just emerging. And optimizing the value will be worth more than reducing the cost of solar energy and time. And that's the next competitive horizon. And that's what at least Sunpower and I think the country needs to be focused on, because that's what the country's good at. And so that, yes, big time. As a Silicon Valley company, we better be.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to close with some conversation about climate change and kind of big picture where we headed, and turn to Cameron, because you wrote an interesting piece recently. You called the Paris Agreement, I think, a huge step forward, but you called on governments to revise their pledges well ahead of the 2020 timeframe for doing that. Why did you do that, and how successful do you think the Paris Agreement is at this point?
Right, yeah, I mean, I think it is a big step forward, and I agree with David. It is a bit of a Republican agreement. It's kind of decentralized. It's a bit bottom-up. The problems with it, though, as probably most of the room is aware, is that the pledges don't add up to anything like well below 2 degrees. So you've got this grand global, well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5 degrees. And then you've got a set of country pledges, which you add them up, you're looking at above 3 degrees. And then you dig a bit more and you say, well, are the countries actually implementing their pledges? And what's the detail? Where's the detail? Where are the policies? Where are the rules? And when we put that together, what does that add up to? And they're not even delivering on their promises. So the point of this paper was just to say, it's great to have an agreement. Yes, it is a huge step forward, but it's not going to do any good unless people make promises that are realistic and then deliver on those promises. And at the moment, we've got promises that are not realistic, and even the promises that were, plausibly realistic are not being delivered upon. So I don't want to be the kind of, depressed guy in the room, because I think it is fantastic that we've got this architecture, as you say. But we're at the point now where we need to call the governments of the world to account and say, well, you claimed you were serious about this, let's show us the money.
Dave, I wonder about your vision for how the world takes this on and the problem of climate change. And I'll put you on the spot and say, if you had to rank climate change as a problem from 0 to 10, and where 10 is a catastrophic problem and 0 is let's not worry about it, where would you put the problem? And then what's a vision for addressing this problem that you would embrace?
So I think it depends on where you sit, right? If you're an island out in the Pacific, small island, I think it's probably 9 or 10, right? If you talk to the Russians, maybe it's a 0, because they will argue that there are positive benefits, right? The United States, depending on the region, so it really does depend. I think, and I'm not trying to dodge the answer, but I do think that, at least from the Trump administration's perspective, and I agree with this, that's my personal view as well, is that climate is certainly a challenge and is a major problem that we need to work together to address. But there are other big issues out there that I think, I would certainly argue, are much more challenging, much more immediate when you're looking at nuclear proliferation. How do you make and some people will argue, look, climate change has an impact on global security, and I agree with that. But I think that there are other issues that have more of an impact and just have more consequences when it comes to global security. And one of those is energy access, it's poverty eradication, those kind of issues that certainly have a much more direct effect on political security today, right?
It depends on what you're trying to optimize for.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that, Jeannette?
Well, you set priorities based on some function that you're, in the end, trying to optimize for. That's what I mean. So whether it's energy access, whether it's, for instance, political security versus economic security, there's that is what policymakers struggle with. They have to prioritize. And then based on those priorities, then they say, okay, we're going to rank these issues, 0 to 10. How else can you actually do policy?
Cameron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm an economist, and I love a good trade-off, right? But it's important not to construct false choices either. You don't say, well, health is more important than education, so we'll just do health. Yeah, we'll just leave education aside, or getting rid of malaria is more important than world hunger, so we'll just do malaria. I agree, nuclear proliferation is more important, more pressing, more immediate than climate. But it doesn't mean you don't do climate.
Right.
Right.
Ruth?
Yeah, I would add that part of the rating is how hard it is to fix a problem when a long-term problem becomes an acute problem. And the more we go along with climate change and have more and more emissions, the harder it is to fix the problem, because we live in a very complex planet that we frankly don't understand everything that we're doing to it. And the harder it is to get back to a 2-degree state, the more we go along. So I think part of the rating system has to be how the ease of fixing and where you would want to attack a problem, knowing the lag effects and the long-term
And that 2 degrees centigrade, by the way, is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, right? For all the Americans in the audience, right? Dave?
Yeah, just a quick response. I certainly think we can do both at the same time. That's good. But I will argue this. I think a lot of my colleagues on, to the left, I don't think they necessarily agree with that, or at least not where we're coming from. So, for example, You know, the Trump administration will argue, look, you know, if the world is going to be using fossil fuels, you know, from now until whenever. Fossil fuels are going to continue to play a major role in powering the global economy. And so therefore, we just need to face that reality and make sure that the fossil that's being deployed is used as cleanly and as efficiently as possible, right? It's a rational approach to this. But then some of my colleagues in Europe and elsewhere will say, no, you know, that's just not politically acceptable at this point. But I think that we have to face the reality. And back to sort of making the Paris Agreement more effective, we need to have a real discussion on pathways for technology development, deployment, commercialization, right? Because if we're not working to solve the technology piece of this, you're not going to address climate mitigation effectively.
Quick response, Carmen?
Yeah, so I think I agree with most of that. The thing that I'd add is that as I agree with Ruth too, you've got to be looking ahead here. So fossils going to be around for a long time. It's very important. You know, I argue against the fossil fuel divestment campaigners. There's probably some in the audience that this is a problem. You can't just kind of sell your shares and wash your hands of it. We've got to engage and manage this transition.
Right.
I think the thing though is what you don't want, and this is as much a problem perhaps for the Chinese as it is for the Americans, is investments in new long-lived capital that's going to be around for several decades that is incompatible with where we need to be. So you kind of think about where we need to be, which is roughly 0 by 2050, and work backwards and say, what the hell are we doing with a global coal pipeline of 450 gigawatts? You know, the overall US power system is probably, I guess, around 1,000 gigawatts, maybe a bit more. I'm not American, but so you've got half of the US power system being added potentially in the pipeline, and this is nuts. It just can't. So a rational approach is absolutely the right way to go. But it does rule out some things as being stupid. I mean, they may look possibly sensible for a few years if you're taking a very short-term perspective, but then if you think, actually, I'm going to have to write this asset off in 15 years and I won't have got the returns that I expected, that's not so smart.
We're about out of time. I want to close on this by turning to Ruth, because Ruth has written a really great book, which I recommend, called The Big Ratchet. And as she puts it, the book charts humanity's journey from an ordinary mammal to a world-dominating, urban-dwelling species. So it's kind of a modest task you take on in the book, Ruth. But kind of with that big picture evolutionary perspective, what are your thoughts about our ability to take on this challenge of climate change? Are we up to it?
Well, what that book traces is all of the times we've been at that 9 or 10 and how we've wiggled our way out of it. And there are many examples through history where there's been some big problem, like there's not enough fertilizer for the fields in Europe and there's not going to be enough food, and then we've created these problems. So the story is that we're such an intelligent, big-brained species that we're very, very good at creating problems. And because we create problems, we then have to create solutions. So we're in this perpetual cycle of creating problems and solutions, and we will always be in that perpetual cycle. Right now, we are at a moment where we've created a big problem with climate change, and wonderful to hear about working towards those solutions to those problems, which will inevitably create some more problems. So we're always in this cycle. But you can take that as an optimistic message or a pessimistic message, as you wish. But I think that is always with us. We are always experimenting with this planet that we live on.
Well, Jeannette, Ruth, Cameron, Dave, Tom, thank you for your insights. Please join me in giving them a big hand.